today I want to talk about the constrictions many open world games pose upon us as players and how we can cope with that. How we can try to bend such games' borders or overcome their limitations. Open world games promise so much freedom, and partly they deliver that freedom. But when you look beyond the pretty surface, you notice a few problems which restrict our freedoms. This talk is partly based on my book, Let's Play, What We Can Learn from Computer Games About Life. This book is directed especially towards people who are skeptics about playing computer and video games. For example, a colleague of mine in one of my other jobs told me once, "My children don't play video games." I decided to write a book as an answer to this skepticism, trying to show why playing ordinary video and computer games can be useful in a variety of ways. And as I said, this talk is based on this book. For this talk, I chose two of my favorite games I play a lot, The Elder Scrolls and X4 Foundations, because these games can absorb me for many, many hours. Partly due to their atmosphere, partly due to an effective gameplay loop. I love the nature and the landscapes of the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. It often feels like coming back to my favorite vacation spot or like a virtual home. I also love the mixture of lonely, melancholic space atmospheres and bustling space economy in the X series. But at the same time, I dislike these games, when I notice, for example, that I am forced to play in a specific way, which is especially disappointing in these examples because these games usually stand for a lot of freedom, or at least they are marketed in this way. But the Elder Scrolls are full of bland little quests with repetitive narrative structures and repetitive dungeons, and with very restricted possibilities for meaningful action. And in the X series, this is a capitalist dream where economic growth in a war-ridden world is at the core of the gameplay, and with no way to change that. Some years ago in my PhD thesis, I wanted to understand what computer users say and do when their usage is disturbed. And I start with that because in the end, computer games are software. And this is the starting point whenever I think about games. So would the users be able to adapt to the disturbance and regain control, or would the usage situation stop and would the people change to another mode of interaction, for example, asking somebody for help, reading the manual, or anything like that? For reducing the complexity of my task, I reduced my observed human beings to simple models, which I called user systems. This was an influence by Niklas Luhmann's social systems theory, which we did all back then in the chair where I was. The software was considered as environment of the user systems, and a user system was defined as the difference of its own reproduction and the disruptions from the system's environment. Or in simpler terms, my test subjects were in front of a computer, and as long as my subjects were able to fulfill their task by producing inputs to the computer, recognizing its outputs and answering to outputs by new inputs, the subjects were observed in the mode of user system structurally coupled with your software environment. Sometimes a disturbance occurred, for example, an error message, or the computer simply froze. If the user system was able to process such disturbances and adapt to it by finding a way around the error or the freeze, usage continued. Sometimes, of course, this adaptation was not successful. Then usage stopped, and instead of user systems, I could observe my subjects in a different mode, for example, as parts of interaction systems with other persons when they asked for the help. As long as the usage continued, it formed the basis for much more interesting observations on a second level in my work, connected to the problems to solve and the type of software used. I don't have the time here to mention all the observation modes I tried in my thesis, and not all are relevant for gaming and today's conference, but at least one I want to outline briefly, and this is when software becomes a medium for a user, so the user can fulfill a specific role. For example, when I use an Office program for writing my frog talk and creating slides for my talk, I am not just a user of that Office software. I don't use it for the sake of using it. I'm also not using it just for being the author of some text or some slides. I don't want to solve a problem, write some text, and create some slides. I want to solve another problem with the software related to my role in a context much broader than the usage situation itself. In the example, I want to solve a problem of strengthening my identity as a games researcher at a conference. This is why I use the software. The problem I want to solve with the specific software. And this is, of course, much larger than the usage situation itself. But as long as the software flawlessly supports me in solving this problem, the software works as a medium here for helping me solving my problem of presenting myself as a researcher. And the structures that on the most basic level are observable as system environment couplings maybe become meaningful in regard of user goals and broader contexts, such as, and now I come to the topic, role-playing games. Games allow us to see ourselves and try out ourselves in other roles, and open world games promise to provide great freedom of trying out these roles. But when we play a game for a long time, we get to know its boundaries. Sometimes we also search for boundaries, of course, in games right from the start. How does the game react if I don't follow the intended path? Does it break? Or have the developers considered my actions? Maybe you know the roguelike game NetHack, a very, very classic roguelike with ASCII graphics and all. And there's a saying about NetHack: the dev team thought of everything, meaning that even the most absurd user actions are catched and receive a somewhat appropriate reaction. However, there are boundaries, of course, in such a game too. In NetHack's example, it's the main setting or the main goal. Be a hero, go into a deep dungeon, retrieve some valuable amulet, and return alive. And I would argue that many games today are, in their core, not much deeper. In role-playing games like The Elder Scrolls, we are considered heroes, not just as the protagonists of our own story, but in the literal sense, as an exceptional person which appears in the game world and solves all the small and big problems of the other people. We collect herbs, we kill dragons, we unite failed lovers, and we free a country of evil rulers and so on. We are apparently the only person at all who is able to manage the other people's everyday lives. This is somewhat ironic when you look closer what we actually do in such games and how the games reacts to it and what a hero actually should be. With the philosopher Hannah Arendt, a hero is specifically a human who is observable as acting person in the political space. Action is a specific kind of activity which Arendt distinguishes from labor and work, and I will come back to this distinguishment a bit later. And therefore, as Anja-Katrin Held wrote about Arendt, especially visibility and audibility are necessary for a person to be seen as acting and speaking. And this is something lacking in many games. In games, we may replay the hero journey of some pre-made narrative, but we are usually not able to perform actions in the political sense independently from pre-scripted story bits. The game's engine does not hear us, so to say. For example, in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, many big political problems are mentioned on the narrative level, but we, the players, have only rarely the possibility to act in a political sense, to influence these problems. As you may know, Skyrim is a fictional country and part of the Empire of Tamriel. Most inhabitants belong to a people called Nord. There's a big civil war in Skyrim which threatens to tear the country apart. The Nord's main god Talos was forbidden as a result of a peace treaty between the Empire and another faction, and this led to the civil war. The nationalist and rebellious Stormcloaks fight against the Empire, and the screenshot here on the right side of my slide, that's the leader of the Stormcloak faction. In the game, this setting is shown in scripted scenes between non-playing characters, fictional historical documents, and contextualizing quests. The setting actually has a lot of potential to explore questions of political and religious freedom and the role of an individual person in a war situation. But for us, as players of the game, the civil war is reduced mainly to the decision for one or the other side represented in pre-made quest lines. As a third alternative, we may only ignore the whole war quest line at all. The decision for one side of the civil war leads to specific quests, such as taking part in certain battles, but there's no possibility outside of this decision to act in a meaningful way to solve the political situation. Either we fight in the war or we ignore this part of the game. We cannot strive for a political solution. We cannot intervene diplomatically. We cannot convince important individuals to simply cancel the war. On this picture here, I took this from the Elder Scrolls wiki at uesp.com. This is just to show how schematic this war storyline is. You have the two sides, and the structure of the quests is the same for both, and there's no way to break out of this. So we cannot break off the pre-designed game loop and narration, but exactly this would be necessary if we wanted to use the game to explore our own acting in this political sense. When we play this part of the game, then only on a railroad, despite the open world design, with a narrative which is sparse but easily consumable. Within the constraints of the game, we cannot make a difference. We cannot be heroes in the game because we are not free to act. Another game from my love-hate list is the space economy and space action game X4 Foundations. You travel through various star systems, trade with goods, and fight for and against other factions in the game. You also build potentially huge factory complexes and buy many ships, which you can all fly yourself or give over to AI pilots. So you start as a small freelancer, but may become the owner of a rich mega corporation, eventually being a major power in the game world. There's a lot to do until you reach this point, and the game can keep you busy for months, even years. Some players started their current playthrough in 2018 when the game was released, and they are still playing the same save game. All this happens in front of a never-ending war between the various factions. These wars are not just illustrative. War is in fact the center of the game's simulated economy. All the goods you trade with or produce in your factories are in one way or another consumed in this war economy. When you produce food in your orbital farms, this food is consumed by other factories which produce other goods, such as weapons and ships, which fight each other and other factories to gain an advantage. This kind of war can potentially go on forever, and as I said, for some players, it goes on since 2018. X4 has very regular production chain mechanics, which we also know from many other games, but X4 makes it very easy to immerse in its world, thanks to pretty space views and soothing electronic music. Also, piloting the various ships is quite fun. However, the thought of actually living in such a world seems like a nightmare to me. Now, in science fiction, we often have the motive of factories in space, for example, to save the environment of a planet, or the production is put into the orbit. And I think somewhere in the lore of this X series, something like that is also mentioned. But in the actual game, no goods are ever sent to civilians living on the planets. In fact, the planets play no role at all. They are just beautiful background images in the game. For a long time, I did not think about this. I just explained it away with some affordances of game design and the game's genre. But then a DLC was released for the game, which brought our very own solar system into the game world, including our Earth, which I visited, of course. And when I sat there in my ship and watched our beautiful planet, but without any possibility to land on it, I felt a strange emotional response, which I really did not expect to get from this game. I felt very melancholic, nearly sad, and the whole game felt somehow wrong to me. I felt that Earth was the most beautiful planet in the whole game, and I felt sad that the game did not allow me to find a way to protect it from all the wars or to connect with it, really. Partly it was a similar frustration which I felt for Skyrim, but there was more to it here. After reading Hannah Arendt's Vita Activa of the human condition a bit, I recognized the reason for my strange feelings. Earth is deeply related to our very human condition as living beings. But the X4 game does not allow me to land on Earth. It does not allow me to reconnect with my human condition. But ironically, the Earth DLC for this game is called Cradle of Humanity. or in German, Wiege der Menschheit. As I mentioned, Hannah Arendt had 3 different concepts of human activity: labor, work, and action, belonging to different contexts. Labor is related to the biological life of the human body. Work is related to the artificial world of things which humans create, and action is related to humans living together in societies and thus the political space. The 3 types of activity are deeply related to each other, and so far they are also all related to birth and death. For Arendt, labor takes care of the survival of individuals and humanity as a whole. Work, as the creation of durable things, counteracts the futility of our ephemeral life, and action creates the conditions of our remembering. These are the basic conditions of humanity, so to say, the human condition, although by labor, work, and action we create additional conditions all the time. Arendt connects this human condition with the fact that we as a species are earthbound. When she wrote her book, the Soviet Sputnik satellite had just been sent into space, an event which Arendt considered as meaningful as no other before in mankind's history. The first time we were able to overcome the borders of our planet. But Earth is the quintessence of our human condition. Only on Earth, human beings can move and breathe effortlessly. But still, humans strive to leave these positive conditions, strive to leave Earth and the natural life. The future human, as Arendt wrote, is obsessed with a rebellion against human existence. And games like X4 Foundations show us a possible end result of these assumed developments. In X4, players experience humanity as space-bound people. The narrative of the game tells us that they still live on planets, but these planets are of no importance in the game. Players travel in small and huge spaceships from one space station to another, and they do this always in the modes of labor and work. There's no possibility for action in the political sense. Very much like in the Elder Scrolls Skyrim, there's no way to end the wars, for example. Because if players could end the wars in the game would stop. The war is needed for the game's economy to not stall. Goods are only needed if other goods are consumed, and since planets and civilian life on planets has no place in the game, the only way of consuming goods is in fact this war. As players of this game, we can of course also become victims in the war. So players are forced to defend themselves, to defend their property they gained in the long play. Now, the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm distinguished 2 modes of existence when it comes to property. On the one hand, the mode of having, on the other hand, the mode of being. I think you may know all this. The mode of having emphasizes the value of personal property, not just related to material property, but also in our language, for example, when we talk about our identity, like it is my body, my name, my knowledge, and so on. Or our relationships to others, when I say my wife, my employee, as well as our ideas and beliefs. Fromm criticized this property focus. He said it is dead and not alive, because when we have a property, we need to protect the property to prevent others from taking it from us. Very often, this requires some kind of power, and the power often comes in the form of violence, and this potentially leading to death. And growing, managing, and protecting my empire in the game X4 keeps me busy for hours and hours. But this busyness, according to Fromm, is just red. We are busy and occupied, but distant, alienated from ourselves. And in the case of X4, this shows like we are alienated from our planet. As contrast to the stressful mode of having, Fromm suggests a mode of being with a focus on inner growth, love, and real interest in other persons. Activity in this mode would focus on personal talents. Growing is not meant as economic growth, but as bringing one's own talents to bloom. Fromm speaks of a kind of productivity which is not focused on creating and owning material goods. We can also be productive when we, for example, just read a poem and feel empathy for the feelings expressed in that poem. And for computer games, this can mean we can be more productive in Fromm's sense by playing a small indie game with a low production value, but deep emotional story or innovative game concepts, than by sinking hundreds of hours in a virtual economy and military empire. But despite all this, I still like my Elder Scrolls game and I like my X4 game. I said these are two of my favorite games, despite these problems. So isn't there a way of playing that allows for freedom and even for action? And here come mods to mind, of course. Elder Scrolls games have a very active modding community. X4 has also a modding scene, and I use mods, but in the end, even with mods in X4, the war will still affect you and demand engagement in it, just as in the Elder Scrolls, you'll come to a point where the implemented actions in the game software simply do not match what you actually prefer to do in a given situation. Therefore, I don't try anymore to find freedom in restricted open worlds, at least not in the software. I try something different. And this is the end now, the last 3 parts now, to answer the question of the topic of my talk. The first one is, I try to extend this user-system relationship. When the input-output sequences which keep me in the game loop on the system level are not sufficient anymore for immersing in the game as medium, I extend the user-software relation by bringing additional devices into play, like props in a theater. For example, when I play Elder Scrolls games, I often take a written journal with me on paper, which I write from the point of view of a character I imagine to play. When you'd observe me as a user, you'd notice that the observable activities happen between me, the software, and the journal. The game flow is slower. It's no simple input-output relation anymore, but the journal helps to stay in the game, even when the software itself would throw me out of my immersion. It is a bit similar to writing fan fiction, I admit, but I do it while I play the game, as part of my game and based on events that happen in the software. The outcome of my writing may very well influence what I do next in the software, so the writing can be an essential part of the gameplay loop for me. The consequence, and this is the second point, is that I engage more creatively with the game, of course. I am not just kept busy by the designed software, but I try to find a creative way of dealing with it. When I play, for example, the role of a historian who witnesses the war in Skyrim, I take note of events. I also read fictional historic accounts written by other players, which I printed on paper before. So sometimes you can find me in my room, the same room I'm sitting right now. On my computer screen, you can see a cozy library with a fireplace, and you may wonder what I do there. I don't touch the controls of the game software. I just read some text or write something in the journal. When you find me like this, I am simply immersed in playing my chosen role, even if no input-output activities with the software occur. The software is still important, though. The software creates a mood and a context for the real game, which I play happily in my head and on paper. I may, for example, reflect about in-game situations not solvable for the character in the software, but in my head canon, in my head, it works. For example, the peace negotiations never take place in the game, but for me, in my head, I've also thought about possible conditions, outcomes, and interpretations of such a peace negotiation. And if I come to the conclusion that the civil war ends in the game, I accept that as truth for the rest of this character's playthrough. So instead of suspending my disbelief in the game world, I intentionally disbelieve what is shown by the software about the game world. The software is just a small window, never showing the complete picture. The whole story happens in my head. This approach to play fits especially well with the Elder Scrolls series, because this game series makes good use of unreliable narrators anyway. Now I come to the last part. I need to hurry a bit. When the game software fails to fulfill my needs in a given situation, such as the Skyrim problems, the continued use is at risk, of course. It's just not immersive when I notice the seemingly open world poses restrictions on my actions. When this happens, the holistic game situation decomposes into parts. I recognize it's just a designed product. What remains of a situation is at best only observable as a loose constellation of parts. I use the terms situation and constellation here in a phenomenological sense, interested in the perception of situations. According to Hermann Schmidt's take on phenomenology, a situation consists of facts, programs, and problems. But we perceive these aspects not one after another, but all together, immediately and holistically. And a successful game software where we continuously could suspend our disbelief manages to create such situations. Now I talked about my use of additional props besides the software, and these props are a means of saving a situation which is at risk to fall apart. When I use my journal or printed lore texts or any other props together with the software to play, I can make use of these props to stabilize my suspension of disbelief. When Skyrim as a software does not allow me to do something against that civil war, I usually would fall out of my immersive state. The game would stop to work as a medium for my roleplay, but props as fallback devices help me to stick to my role, despite the software working against it. All these examples are probably not gaming from the typical gamer point of view. It's more playing in a spontaneous, maybe childlike way. Unfortunately, this type of play seems not to be very common when it comes to computer games. Computer games are mostly used as a product designed for a specific experience, and most mainstream gaming media focus on that. But instead of providing detailed guides on how to build the most efficient character with the best skill point distribution and the highest damage per second output, gaming journals and websites could motivate for a less restricted use instead. Because relearning to play in a childlike way and using props and resources outside of the software to enhance the whole experience of these open world games, this is basically the one advice I can give to escape the limitations of designed games. Thank you very much.